Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. Have you ever asked yourself if the love you've been chasing your whole life was never really about her at all? From the moment you were old enough to feel loneliness, a quiet promise was planted deep inside you. You heard it in lullabies, read it in fairy tales, saw it in films. They all told the same story, that someday someone would arrive to make you whole. And so you waited. You imagined her. You gave her a face long before she ever appeared. Not because you were naive, but because no one ever told you that love could be something else, something earned, not granted, something real, not romanticized. So when she arrived, you gave her everything: your trust, your hope, your wounds. You looked at her like she was a mirror and mistook your reflection for salvation. You called it fate. You called it love. But maybe it was a story you needed to believe, because it felt easier to worship her than to face yourself, easier to lose yourself in the dream than to confront the silence you never learned to hold. So now ask yourself, did you love her, or did you just love who you got to be? In her gaze, you were taught that love would save you, not through words spoken outright, but through stories wrapped in bedtime comfort, in pop songs playing softly as you grew up in the silent dreams built into your view of manhood. Love, they said, would be your redemption. It would be pure, selfless, unconditional. One day someone would come along who would see all your flaws and love you anyway. And not just love you, but complete you, fix you, heal you, finally make all the pain worth it. And so without realizing it, you began to wait for her. You shaped your life around the possibility of her. You didn't prepare to stand alone, you prepared to be chosen, because being chosen meant you mattered. Her love would prove your worth. Her affection would wash away your doubts. You didn't learn to carry yourself, you learned to be carried. But what if that promise was never meant to be kept? What if it was a myth built not to free you, but to keep you compliant? What if love, as it was sold to you, was just a softer kind of prison? When she arrived, you didn't just meet a woman, you met a narrative. And you handed her a script she never agreed to read. Every smile, every touch, every silence was interpreted through a lens of hope. But hope untethered from truth becomes illusion. And illusions, no matter how beautiful, always crack. You didn't fall in love with her. You fell in love with the idea that she could save you, that if she stayed, you were enough. But love built on dependency is not love, it's worship. And worship turns people into mirrors. So when she pulled away, it wasn't betrayal, it was reality. Reality reminding you that no one can be your meaning, that no one should carry the weight of your identity. Real love doesn't arrive to complete you. It arrives after you've remembered who you are without needing anyone else to remind you. You didn't love her, not really. You loved the way she made you feel about yourself. You loved the reflection she offered, one where you were enough, where you mattered, where you were finally seen. But what if that reflection wasn't love? What if it was validation? And what if validation, when mistaken for love, becomes a trap you willingly walk into? She smiled at you and you mistook it for intimacy. She touched your arm and you thought it was connection. But deep down, what you craved wasn't her. It was who you got to be in her presence. You didn't fall for her soul. You fell for your reflection shining back at you through her eyes. The man you wished you were. The version of yourself you hoped was real. And that's the tragedy. Because the moment she stops reflecting that image, the illusion begins to fade. She says less. She looks at you differently. And suddenly, you're not just losing her, you're losing the version of yourself she used to mirror, the version you never learned to hold on your own. You called it heartbreak. But it wasn't just grief, it was identity collapse. You built your self-worth around her gaze, and when that gaze disappeared, so did your sense of self. That's not love. That's dependency dressed up in desire. Real love doesn't say, "Make me feel whole." It says, "I am whole and I see you." But you were never taught that kind of love. You were taught to bargain, to earn approval, to perform. So when you met her, you didn't build a relationship, you built a stage. And every gesture, every vulnerability was a performance begging for affirmation. She may not have known it, you may not have known it, but love that begins with a need to be validated will always end in resentment. Because no one can be your mirror forever. And when they stop showing you what you want to see, you'll call it distance. You'll call it change. But it's really just the end of the performance. You didn't love her. You loved who you got to be in her light. And until you learn to see yourself without needing her gaze, you'll keep chasing ghosts and calling them soulmates. She wasn't given power, not the kind that could be seen, measured, or institutionalized. She wasn't handed authority in the outer world. No thrones, no weapons, no systems designed to protect her voice. So she learned to work within silence, within subtlety, within the emotional undercurrents that most men were never taught to notice. She didn't choose manipulation. She learned adaptation, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Because survival doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears empathy. For centuries, while men conquered land, led armies, built industries, women survived in a world that rarely let them speak openly or lead directly. So they developed a different skill set. Not brute strength, but emotional intelligence. Not command, but influence. And while you were learning to raise your voice, she was learning how to read your silences. While you were taught to take control, she was taught to anticipate, to sense danger in tone, to hear intention behind words, to feel power in pauses. And now, in the modern world, you mistake her depth for softness. You call her gentle, fragile, innocent. You think she's pure because she doesn't confront. But what you're seeing isn't passivity, it's precision. It's rehearsed control, a mastery of relational space developed over generations of being unseen and unheard. She doesn't need to shout. She only needs to suggest. She doesn't need to demand. She only needs to redirect your desire. Because she knows that presence can be more powerful than pressure. That silence can be louder than shouting. And while you think she's giving, she's actually assessing. Not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. She knows how much of herself to reveal and how much to hold back. She knows which questions to ask to keep your guard down, which glances to offer, which silences to fill with possibility. And you call it chemistry. But it's skill. It's survival turned subconscious. You think she's being vulnerable, but she's reading the room, reading you. And here's the part that's hardest to admit: you admire her for it until you realize it means she may see more of you than you see of her. That her tenderness isn't naive, it's strategic. That her quiet isn't emptiness, it's agency. And once you feel that imbalance, it shakes your sense of control. Because it reveals a truth no one prepared you for. She doesn't need to overpower you to guide you. She just needs to understand you better than you understand yourself. And that's not manipulation. That's what happens when someone survives in the shadows. For too long, they learn how to see clearly in the dark. They never taught you this part. That in love, power doesn't always belong to the one who loves the most, but often to the one who needs the least. You weren't prepared for that equation because every story you grew up with told you that the more you give, the more you'll receive. That emotional generosity equals intimacy. That transparency is strength, but in reality, love has its own quiet mathematics. And need distorts the balance. You give her your time, your energy, your attention, your identity. Not because she demands it, but because you feel that giving more will make her stay. And for a while she does. Not because she's convinced, but because you're invested. And that investment becomes your trap. Because now you can't afford to lose her. You've already poured too much of yourself into her presence. You're no longer offering love, you're managing emotional risk. Meanwhile, she gives sparingly, not cruelly, not manipulatively, but cautiously, strategically. She knows that presence has value, that absence has gravity, and while you reach out, she retreats just enough to keep you leaning forward. You think you're chasing love, but what you're really chasing is the validation that keeps slipping further from your grasp. You mistake her restraint for mystery. You call it depth. But it's something older, more primal. It's control. Not through dominance, but through emotional calibration. She never says, "I need you to give more." She doesn't have to, because your need speaks louder than her words. Because the moment you showed her you couldn't walk away, she understood the rhythm of power. This doesn't make her malicious. It makes her intuitive. And it reveals something uncomfortable. The one who can live without the relationship holds the reins. Not because they manipulate, but because they don't bargain. And you're bargaining. Every gesture, every compliment, every vulnerability is an offer, a quiet trade. If I give you more of me, will you stay? But love rooted in transaction always becomes performance. And performance breeds anxiety. You begin to monitor your words. You second-guess your instincts. You become a version of yourself that exists only in her presence. You've confused emotional openness with surrender. And now you find yourself orbiting around her approval, calling it connection. But it isn't connection, it's choreography. A dance where you move and she watches. Until one day you realize you were never leading. You were following her silence. You didn't fall in love with her. You fell in love with the story she fit into. The one you started writing years before she ever arrived. A story whispered to you through fairy tales and love songs, where a woman would come and make everything okay. A story where her presence would validate your worth, her attention would soothe your wounds, and her affection would fix what you never dared to face alone. She became the stage, the canvas, the emotional mirror, and you projected onto her every unspoken hope, every silent ache. You saw her not for who she was, but for what she represented: redemption, completion, safety. She didn't ask to be those things, but in your mind she already was. And that's where it began, the confusion between love and narrative. Because when she smiled at you, it wasn't just her smile. It was the confirmation that you were lovable. When she stayed, it wasn't just presence. It was proof that you were enough. But this wasn't about her. It was about the version of yourself you got to be when she looked at you a certain way. You weren't addicted to her. You were addicted to the feeling she gave you about yourself. And that's why it hurts so much when she leaves. Not because her body is gone, but because your reflection disappeared with it. You're not grieving the loss of love. You're grieving the loss of identity, the collapse of a self-image built not through self-awareness, but through someone else's gaze. You thought the pain came from losing her. But the deeper pain is this: without her, you don't know who you are. Because you handed her the pen and asked her to write your worth. You gave her the spotlight and performed. Not for connection, but for confirmation. And when she stopped clapping, you didn't just feel abandoned, you felt erased. But here's the hard truth: she didn't betray you. She just stopped reading the script you wrote. And now, without the story, you're left with silence, with emptiness, with the reflection you never learned to hold on your own. But that silence isn't punishment, it's invitation. A doorway into something real. Something not written in fantasy, but forged in truth. Because when you stop needing someone else to validate your existence, you can finally meet love not as a role, not as a performance, but as a choice made by someone whole. You thought you were loving her, but if you look closer, really look, you'll see you were submitting. Quietly, gradually, softly. Not because she asked you to, but because somewhere deep inside you believed it was the only way to be loved. That if you gave her more of yourself, more affection, more patience, more pieces of your soul, she would stay. She would choose you. She would heal the parts of you you didn't know how to hold. But that isn't love. That's bargaining dressed up in poetry. You didn't offer your heart freely. You offered it with a condition, spoken or not. If I give you everything, will you finally make me feel whole? You performed, you adjusted, you shrunk yourself where needed and inflated what you thought she wanted. You erased discomfort, silenced opinions, ignored instincts, all in the name of being a good man. You called it sacrifice. But what you sacrificed was authenticity. You called it commitment. But what you committed to was invisibility. And the worst part, you thought that made you strong. You thought vulnerability meant giving all of yourself, even if it cost your sense of self. You confused emotional availability with emotional dependence. You didn't draw boundaries, you begged to be accepted inside hers. She didn't demand your submission, you gave it. Not with a collar or a leash, but with a look, a gesture, a withheld compliment. With every time you said yes when your heart whispered no. With every moment you turned your silence into strategy. With every hope that she would love the version of you most willing to disappear. And maybe she did for a while. But no one can love a ghost forever. She may have been touched by your loyalty. She may have adored your softness. But over time, even she could feel it, the weight of being worshipped, the pressure of being your purpose, the unspoken burden of holding your sense of worth. Love rooted in need is never stable. It creates imbalance. One gives while the other simply is. And eventually, that imbalance tips not out of malice but out of gravity. You weren't being noble. You were afraid. Afraid of losing her. Afraid of being alone. Afraid that without her you wouldn't matter. But love doesn't thrive in fear. It thrives in freedom. And until you learn to stand in your own wholeness, what you offer won't be love, it will be surrender, masquerading as romance. They told you love was about unity, about connection, about two people giving their all and meeting in the middle. That's what the fairy tales said. That's what the wedding vows promised. But in the real world, especially in the silent corners of modern relationships, love often operates more like a game of leverage than a meeting of souls. It doesn't begin with bad intentions. It begins with fear. Fear of losing ground. Fear of being too much. Fear of being too little. And so instead of honesty, we start negotiating. Quietly, subtly, emotionally. Who texts first? Who apologizes first? Who becomes vulnerable first? And who holds back just enough to maintain control? These aren't just habits. They're power moves, invisible ones. No one talks about them because they happen in the spaces between words, in the timing of a reply, in the temperature of a silence, in how affection is rationed like currency. And you, maybe without realizing it, learned to play this game. You thought you were loving freely, but you were measuring. You thought you were being open, but you were calculating what her reaction might be. You withheld your truth just enough to remain desirable. She did the same. And this isn't manipulation. It's conditioning. Men were taught to conquer the world. Women were taught to manage relationships. And now, both are navigating intimacy through blueprints built on survival, not love. You think she's being distant? Maybe she's testing how much you'll chase. You think you're giving space. Maybe you're avoiding vulnerability disguised as respect. Every move becomes choreography. Every gesture has weight. Every act of affection has an undertone of will. This shift the balance in my favor. And the one who needs less emotionally, logistically, spiritually, almost always ends up with more influence. Not because they fight harder, but because they fight less. Detachment becomes power, and desperation becomes weakness. The person who's more willing to walk away usually doesn't have to. But here's the painful part. Most of this is subconscious. Neither of you may be aware that you're in a dance for control. But your nervous systems know, your silences know, your reactions know. And before long, the relationship isn't built on love, it's built on emotional strategy. You're not seeking closeness, you're negotiating it. And until you both stop trying to win, until you stop performing testing, withholding, you'll never really connect. You'll only trade power, back and forth, lovingly, silently, exhaustingly. You thought she was the one, the muse, the answer, the final piece that would make everything make sense. And for a while, she played the role perfectly. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe you just needed her to. Maybe you never really saw her, only the script you were begging her to follow. You didn't love her. You loved who you got to be in her gaze. When she looked at you with admiration, you felt powerful. When she needed you, you felt needed. When she smiled at your softness, you felt safe being seen. But the truth is, you were never just looking at her. You were looking at your reflection, the version of yourself you wanted to believe was real. And when that reflection started to change, when her gaze dimmed, when her admiration shifted, when she stopped being your mirror, it felt like loss. But what you lost wasn't just a woman. You lost the identity you constructed in her presence. That's why it hurt so much, not because she was gone, but because she took the performance with her. And you were left with silence, the kind of silence that echoes, the kind that confronts, the kind that no muse can fill. But maybe that silence isn't the enemy. Maybe it's the invitation. Because here's the truth, she didn't betray you. She just stopped performing. And you called her cruel for no longer reading lines from a script she never wrote. But the betrayal was never hers. It was yours, for placing a fantasy where a human being was meant to stand. For loving an idea and expecting someone real to live inside it. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a projection. You wanted a mirror that made you feel strong, worthy, lovable without having to earn that feeling from within. But a woman is not a mirror. She's not a symbol. She's not a reward for your effort or a stage for your self-worth. She's a person messy, complex, unfinished, just like you. And when you finally stop demanding that she reflect back your ideal self, you can begin to see her. And more importantly, you can begin to see yourself. Because until you stop chasing muses, you'll never meet the person behind the performance. And until you stop performing, you'll never meet yourself. You keep replaying it in your head, the words you said, the ones you didn't, the moments you could have done more or less. You cycle through them like a punishment loop, hoping guilt will somehow cleanse the pain. But guilt is not transformation. Guilt is stagnation dressed in remorse. And shame doesn't bring healing, it just tightens the chains. You tell yourself you ruined it, that you were too emotional, too intense, not enough. Or maybe too much. You bury yourself under the weight of self-blame, convinced that if you carry it long enough, she'll come back. Or at least the version of you she once loved will return. But that's not how this works. She didn't leave because you were flawed. She left because she stopped playing the role. And in doing so, she revealed a truth that most men spend their whole lives running from. No one can hold your identity for you. And now, in her absence, you have a choice. You can collapse under the weight of what you think you did wrong, or you can rise with clarity, the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't need to be forgiven, the kind that simply says, I see now. Clarity is not guilt, it's not shame, it's ownership. Ownership of your projections. Ownership of the illusion you needed her to play. Ownership of the way you made her your mirror instead of your equal. Because the truth is, you didn't love her with freedom. You loved her with expectation. You asked her to validate what you never validated within yourself. And when she stopped doing that, when she stopped reflecting the version of you that made you feel enough, you mistook her honesty for betrayal. But she didn't betray you. She simply stopped pretending. She returned to herself, and now you're being asked to do the same. That's where real growth begins. Not with shame, but with sight. with the ability to look at your past self and say, I understand why you did that, and I'm ready to move differently now. This isn't about blaming her, it's about liberating you. Because as long as you wear guilt like a badge, you're still clinging to the illusion. You're still trying to rewrite a story that was never yours to begin with. But when you choose clarity, real clarity, you no longer need the story. You just need the truth. And from truth, you begin again. Not with regret, but with responsibility. This isn't the end of love, it's the end of illusion. The end of a version of love that asked you to vanish just to be worthy of staying. The end of a fantasy where devotion meant self-erasure, where sacrifice was currency, and where being chosen was more important than being known. You were raised to believe that love is the highest virtue, that a man proves his strength through surrender, that to love unconditionally, even at the cost of your dignity, makes you noble. But what if that nobility was just another form of fear? What if beneath your selflessness was a quiet terror that if you didn't give everything, she wouldn't stay, so you gave more, you compromised more, you disappeared slowly, not because she demanded it, but because the story told you that losing yourself was the price of being loved. And now that she's gone, you're left with the truth. It wasn't love you were protecting. It was the myth. The story that said, if she loves me, I am whole. And when she walked away, it wasn't just heartbreak, it was identity collapse. But here's what you haven't been told: you don't have to destroy love to find freedom. You just have to rebuild it not as fantasy, but as revolution. A revolution where love is no longer a transaction of emotional need, but an expression of emotional truth. Where connection isn't built on dependency, but on self-awareness. Where two whole people meet not to complete one another, but to create something neither of them could build alone. In this new love, there is no pedestal, no rescuer, no performance, only presence, only choice, only clarity. She's not your savior. You're not her project. You don't need her to redeem your loneliness, and she doesn't need you to carry the weight of her silence. You are no longer characters in a myth. You are mirrors. And only by seeing each other clearly, without needing to fix or be fixed, can you begin to love for real. So stop chasing the version of love that asks you to disappear. Start creating the kind that lets you fully exist. Because when you no longer need to be chosen to feel worthy, when you no longer need her love to feel whole, that's when you're finally free to love, not from fear, but from truth. That's not the death of love. That's its beginning. You were never meant to be completed by someone else. The story that love will save you, that someone will arrive to heal your pain and make you whole, is not just outdated. It's dangerous. Because as long as you believe your worth depends on being loved, you'll keep surrendering your power in exchange for validation. The truth is harder, but freer. No one can save you from the work of knowing and loving yourself. No relationship, no woman, no fantasy will ever be enough if you are not at peace with your own reflection. So here's the real invitation. Stop chasing muses. Stop trying to be chosen. Start choosing yourself. Do the hard inner work. Build wholeness from within. Love not because you need to be saved, but because you want to share the journey. A relationship should be two complete people choosing each other, not two broken people begging for completion. Clarity is the gift. Responsibility is the path. And self-ownership is the revolution. Because when you stop needing love to prove your value, you finally become someone who can love freely, fiercely, and without fear.